Hello, dialogue friends. I am really grateful that Jen and I have been asked by the dialogue boards to just put together some thoughts in advance of the election. There is an election coming up. I
Make
don't
it
know.
go away, Patrick. Make it go away.
Um, and so they graciously reached out to the two of us to ask if we had any thoughts, if we could share something like a lesson, a pre-recorded lesson about what the Book of Mormon teaches, especially around peacemaking and civic engagement leading up to the Book of Mormon. So, spoiler alert, we're not going to tell you who to vote for. That's not what we're going to do in this episode. But instead, we're going to try and pull out some principles and patterns from the Book of Mormon that we think may inform the way that we think, not just about how we cast our votes in favor of peace, but actually work as citizens for peacemaking both before and after the election.
So part of the work that we do at MWEG is to help citizens understand that we are all better off when we vote along a series of principles, and we vote as principled voters rather than voting as partisans. And we think that the Book of Mormon has a beautiful set of messages that help us do that. It detaches us from partisanship and can detach us from the things that we're actually arguing about in our society and help us to take a more elevated view of the patterns and the outcomes that we want to see happen. And so we hope that these messages from the Book of Mormon help you as you cast your vote to do so in a way that will aim us as a society toward the beloved community and toward eventually Zion.
Great. Well, let's dive in. So,
Okay.
first principle.
Yeah. Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we want to start with the idea that is really foundational to peacemaking, and that is that peacemakers unify rather than divide. That is one of their main objectives, is to model themselves, particularly as Christians, after a holy being who sought to bring us all together and bring us into alignment with him. Now, the Book of Mormon begins as a family story that teaches us actually a lot about the consequences of division at a very elemental, personal, and familial level. We've talked about this earlier in the podcast, but we've got Lehi and Sariah. They have 4 sons who do not get along. And then they have later children who struggle and reap the consequences of that dysfunction. And the 2 older sons constantly abuse the younger ones. They threaten them on multiple occasions. They threaten them with death and all sorts of pain, and they inflict pain. And the parents aren't able to stop their sons from doing that. I think almost every parent, particularly a parent of boys, probably understands that sometimes we choose violence. But Lehi and Sariah's transparent love, trustworthiness, and their deeply principled familial leadership earns respect from all 4 of those sons. They still manage, in spite of a lot of crisis, tension, exodus, starvation, to be the glue that keeps this family together. And it's only once they die and no one else is able to step up as a unifier that the family tragically splits up and a whole societal kind of conflict spins off from that.
And so how do you think, Jen, how does this relate to our society now? How does this relate to when people are looking at the ballot?
Yeah.
What do Lehi and Sariah have to teach us about the kind of principles of leadership and peacemaking that we should be looking for?
So I think what they have to teach us is that there will always be people in our society who don't get along, who have a hard time understanding each other. They sometimes do harm to each other, and that can result in sort of accumulated pain and frustration. But in a pluralistic and diverse society, which is one we live in, right? We live in a society that is unified by shared government principles. We're not unified by a tribe or a religion. This is a really novel experiment in human history. And when we've done it right, it's been a source of great blessing to the world. So we just remember that this is how America is founded, on this idea that people are going to be different and they're going to come into conflict with one another. And so what we have always needed is leaders who are adept and deeply committed to finding unity and bringing it up out of that division. The leaders who have done that are the ones that have been able to take us through periods of significant conflict and suffering, and to be able to transcend our differences and come to a place of reunification. So that is one of the things that's very important to me as I'm selecting leaders. And this can be true in my town. I have a very small town government, all the way up to the highest office that I vote for. To me, one of my foundational things is this a leader who, while still holding true to their principles, I'm not saying they have to be all in the mushy middle, but that they are committed to the idea that we all need to be first unified in our endeavors and working together.
I think that's exactly what Lehi and Sariah show us, right? Now, again, parents are it's a slightly different role than a political leader, right? So it's not, again, a one-to-one correspondence. But again, the principle here is that they do have, this group of people does not get along, right?
Yeah.
And they go through hardship, and they care about these people. They can't stop them from arguing. But what they bring at the familial level, but I think this can absolutely happen at the community level, ideally at the national level, right, is that the things that unify us are more important than the things that divide us. And they didn't pick favorites, right?
Yeah.
They probably did think that Nephi was right more often than Laman and Lemuel. But they knew that actually they were going to win only if everybody won together as much as they could. And that I think is really important. And so that kind of canary in the coal mine, oftentimes for broader conflict that spirals, you can call it a conflict tornado or something like that, is are there ways that we feed the conflict? Are there ways that there are leaders, divide us and pick favorites and create a us versus them that will inevitably escalate the conflict? That's exactly what we see after Lehi and Sariah leave the scene. Or are our leaders trying to restrain our worst impulses, right? Are they trying to model what it looks like? Not perfectly, but the best they can. Are they trying to be the glue that holds this disparate society together?
So we've talked about this early in the conversation, and I just want to reinforce it almost every time we talk about one of these principles, that we are talking about leaders. We're talking about how we can see the qualities in our leaders that are going to bring us towards societal peace. But again, in a free society, they are representatives of us, and they, we can't hide from the way that they often reveal ourselves to us. So I just want to put a pin in the fact that it is incredibly important for us to model this to everyone around us, in the sense that if we want to have a unified society, there are critical and important roles for each of us as followers of Christ to play in building that unification and always making sure that we are talking about people in ways that are inclusive, that imply that they have a stake in the game, that doesn't make it seem like we think that they're lesser than in terms of being citizens or being participants in our nation. And so are we ourselves modeling this and doing this, speaking about people in a way that pushes us towards unity rather than away from it?
Yeah. Well, I think that connects then to the second principle. So the first principle was the peacemakers seek to unify rather than divide. The second principle that we see emerging from the Book of Mormon is that peacemakers see people as people, not as objects or obstacles. This is so important. I think it flows directly from that first one and what you were just saying. And I think here about the four sons of King Mosiah, right? Ammon and his brothers, that they had been in generations of violent conflict with the Lamanites. These patterns were very well set. The assumptions that each group had about the other were really calcified. And so when they had their conversion experience and they felt prompted by the Spirit to go be missionaries to the Lamanites, right, what are all their friends say? It's like, that's impossible. You're ridiculous, right? They're so hard-hearted. Those people over there are so terrible. They only want to kill you. They are only a danger for you. They could only see them through that lens.
And can I just insert that I think one of the things that's so telling to me is that these men were primed or had offered to them the opportunity to be leaders. That was
Yeah.
what they were born to be under this system.
Groomed. They
And they
probably
made
had
it.
lessons and training.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And yet they've made a decision to lead in a very specifically different way.
Yeah. And so flying in the face of, I mean, the peacemaking is
Yeah.
courageous in the sense that it is willing to be critical of and prophetic towards these assumptions and narratives, the stories that we tell about them, about the
Yeah.
other side, right? Because peacemakers see people as people. And so these sons of Mosiah, they said, no, these aren't these evil, dangerous, bloodthirsty Lamanites. I mean, it's not to neglect our history, right? It's not to neglect the fact that we have been locked in battle for centuries. Our side has suffered, but their side has suffered too,
Yeah.
right? And we're going to see them as children of God. We're going to see them as fellow human beings. And that, I think, is the most radical thing that the sons of Mosiah do. We can talk about the other things they do on their missions to make them effective missionaries, right? The service that Ammon gives and so forth. But all of that stems from the fact that he sees the Lamanites. They all do, Aaron and the others. They see these people as people. It pains them to have this kinds of division, and so they refuse to see them simply as a stereotype. They refuse to see them simply as what social media told them about the Lamanites, right? That they insisted on seeing them as people. So what does this look like, Jen? I mean, this is maybe the biggest thing that we face today, right?
Yeah.
We have algorithms, we have bots, we have disinformation campaigns, right? That are specifically trying to get us to see people as objects. So what does this look like, and how do we apply this principle today?
For me, one of the biggest signs that we've headed in the wrong direction as a society in this regard is the fact that our politics now is zero sum. So it used to be, and we're old, so we remember this, Patrick, that there was a time when basically winning an election, particularly at a federal or a state level where you were overseeing a legislature or, you were representing America in Congress, what that meant is that you had the opportunity to set the agenda. It didn't mean that you got to run the country the way only you wanted to run the country to the detriment of all the people who hadn't voted for you. It meant that you got to set the agenda, and then you worked with the people who you disagreed with to figure out how you could tweak that agenda so that it leaned toward the side that had won the election and was in the majority. And now we're at a point where we literally see each other as obstacles to our agenda. Whether it's on the left or the right, we're concerned that if the other side controls things, then they will just treat our side as obstacles to their path to complete power. And so I think that's something that we have to really watch for, both in ourselves and in our leaders. Are our leaders speaking to us and saying, hey, I am excited about the opportunity to control the agenda, and here is what I'm going to put forward for both sides to discuss and vote on? Or are they saying we have to get enough seats so that we can do whatever we want, regardless of how it hurts other people or whether it's what they agree with? That's treating people as objects or obstacles. And we have an opportunity to vote for leaders who still have signs of collaboration and bipartisanship. And even in this really difficult period in our nation's history, there have been signs of that. But we've gotten to a point where we now punish people who do that.
Yeah.
And that's on us. That's on us as a people, whether we are punishing leaders who work collaboratively or whether we're rewarding leaders who see the opposition as obstacles.
Yeah, and again, this is where we have an entire ballot of people. My sense, and I don't know if you agree, is that the higher you get up the ballot in terms of that there's even more and more incentives for this kind of zero-sum politics. So that's what we see at the national level. But at the local level especially, right? It's like you're talking about like fixing potholes. And
Yeah.
you're talking about like, very but more than that, like actual human issues. What do we do in a community where we've had an influx of immigrants? What do we do where there are a bunch of kids who are going to school hungry? What do we do, with these kinds of human elements of things? And so even if there's a certain amount of like, I don't know that I can do anything to fix things at the national politics, because of course this is what MWEG is doing, right? But also, like, can I do this at a local level? Can I both elect people, and can I do this myself, even after the election, right? Can I be in contact with my elected officials to encourage them and say, hey, I'm on team see people as people, right? That's what I want you to do too.
I'm on team my city. I'm on team my town. I'm on team my state. And I would just argue that this is exactly where all of us can make the biggest difference, because we have a much more likelihood of knowing the people who are on the other side of an issue, and we have the opportunity with pretty much a lot of ease to find them and connect with them. And so I would just encourage all of us who are listening, if you find yourself in a situation where you're despairing about this and you want to personally practice seeing people as people, not as objects or obstacles, your local relationships, community relationships are the best place to start practicing that.
Yeah. Okay, so Jen, what's the third principle?
So our next one is peacemakers show curiosity, not judgment. And we're going to call this Yeah, exactly. So at one point in the Book of Mormon narrative, the Nephites and the Lamanites, they've been, sadly we get to a point where there's just endless conflict in this, with a few brief reprieves. They just are fighting and there's no end in sight. The Nephites' main military leader, Moroni, is deeply frustrated. He's in a high-tension environment. It again feels high stakes. His people are under real and significant threat. And he's frustrated by what he sees as lack of support from the central government. And, communications in that situation are probably not immediate. So he fires off a letter of just rage to the head of government, and he accuses him of treason. He escalates really fast. But what Moroni doesn't know is that leader is fighting his own battle against insurrectionists, and they've taken the capital and they're in alliance with the Lamanites. And Pahoran doesn't reply with self-justification or indignant anger. Instead, he praises Moroni for what he sees as the, quote, greatness of his heart. He sees what is at the root of Moroni's concern, and he shares that concern with Moroni, and he just sort of decides, I'm not going to be personally offended by that. He chooses to believe the best about the person who has just accused him of treason. And I've got to be honest, there's a lot of that flying around this election, right? Yeah. Everyone accusing everybody else of betraying the deepest principles of this government. And he invites him into a relationship where he says, hey, let's work together for this common cause of freedom. And to his credit, Moroni then responds in kind, and together, because of that, they were able to put down the insurrection and secure the peace and freedom of the people. Now, always, we can't say what will happen when we're playing a counterfactual argument, but I cannot imagine that their opportunity to fight the enemy without would have improved if they had started seeing each other as enemies from within. And the key to unlocking that, the key to literally taking a whole different course that saved their society, was one leader showing curiosity and privileging that over judgment.
Yeah, it is so hard to do, right? It's so hard to do in our personal lives when we feel attacked, when we have been attacked, right? Again, this stems from the previous principle of seeing people as people, of having that kind of curiosity. What is it about them, about their situation, about their experience, about what they've seen in life, the set of relationships that they have outside of our relationship that led them to say this or to do this particular thing. Yeah. In my experience, most people are not sociopaths. There are some out there, right? And that's why we have criminal justice systems and so forth to try to remove some of those threats from society. But most people are not. Most people come at politics at the local, at the national level because of a set of experiences, of a way that they see the world. This is where I appreciate the research of people like Jonathan Haidt, the righteous mind. I mean, just people see the world in different ways. And And so I love the historical examples of leaders who have prioritized dialogue with the quote unquote opposition, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Lincoln, I think, really stands out here. His team of rivals, but also his speeches, right, with malice towards none, right?
Yes.
Even towards
Let
the
us
end
be
of the
friends,
war.
not enemies,
Let's
right?
be friends, not enemies, right? Whatever you think about Lincoln, I mean, amazing, probably our best president, certainly up there. There's a reason he's on Mount Rushmore, but it's because he never let go of the fact that these were not enemies that he was fighting against.
And he was always curious.
Yes.
You hear the narratives, and he always wanted to hear explanations before jumping to judgment.
Yeah, he wanted data. He wanted information. He wanted to know what is really going on. He was making those kinds of decisions. So what do you think, Jen? Are there any examples of this or personal stories that you can think of?
I have an embarrassing one. Can I share it?
Yes,
so
please.
I spend a
Sure.
lot of
That's
time
kind.
in Ubers because I travel for
Yeah.
work. And I lived in New York for a while, and boy, do I miss old New York cabbies, because you get in the car and they don't want to talk to you and you don't want to talk to them. And we're here, we're going to a place, we're in a confined space, but it doesn't mean we have to talk to each other.
Right.
I find that Uber drivers, bless them, it would be solitary work, want to talk to me a lot.
Yeah.
And I was recently in a situation where I had a cab driver who really started by just launching, it was bizarre. I don't even know where it came from, but he just said, blah, 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 and then said something really derogatory about someone in a political leader that I actually tend to admire for a lot of reasons. And so then I was like, okay, what are my options here? I tried to signal that I didn't really want to talk. Those signals were not being picked up.
You had your
And
AirPods in and everything, right?
Yeah, no, so my option there was to be curious. That was really the only option I had, Patrick. I could be argumentative. I could try to explain my position in a way I thought it was different. Or in a situation in which I was being forced to have a conversation that I didn't want to have, about a topic that I didn't want to have, about with a person that I had no relationship with, the only way out was curiosity. And so I just kept asking questions. And every time he would say something, and I'm going to tell you right now, 95% of the time I disagreed with it heartily, I would just ask another question. And we got to the end of the ride, and something might have clicked in his head, because he said, "Do you agree with me?" And I said, "I actually don't." I said, "But I have appreciated the chance to understand why you think what you think." And that was the end of the conversation, and I got out of the car. Now, let me tell you why I think that was important. First, it didn't change my heart, and it didn't change his. But I also didn't leave that conversation angry or mad, or I didn't leave either of us worse off than I'd found us.
Yeah.
And I will say that I don't agree with where his experience landed him, the conclusions he drew from those experiences, but I do truly, sincerely understand why he came to those conclusions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't,
Yeah.
I wish he'd drawn different conclusions. I
Sure.
wish that in a different relationship, I would have had time to say, hey, here are some alternative conclusions you could draw from that information, but that wasn't the right time or place. Now, here's why that story doesn't reflect well on me. I'm still a little bit mad about it, Patrick. Like, I wish in my heart, I'm going to be honest with everyone listening, I wish in my heart I'd had the opportunity to tell him why he was wrong. But I didn't, and that's okay, right? So part of it is being curious, and then part of it is what I haven't fixed is the judgment part of me. So I fixed curiosity. Now my next step is to figure out how to not be judgy Jen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there's anything embarrassing about that story at all. I actually think it's exemplary. I mean, and the fact is, we don't all have like unlimited time or deep relationships with everybody we have. Most of our relationships, most of our conversations around politics are probably more like that, right?
Yeah.
They're short, they're brief. Sometimes they're character limited, right, on certain platforms and other things. And so that's why I think it really is exemplary in the sense, like, in this moment, and that's all I'm going to have to get. I do know I'm going to get out of this car.
Yeah.
In this moment, what am I going to choose? And you chose curiosity, so kudos to you. So,
Well,
okay,
can I just make one push before we move on?
yes,
I really want to emphasize how much our society and all of its awesomeness is built on trust. So when
yes,
my children are, I have young adult, college age children, and they have grown up in a period of pretty significant cynicism and difficulty. And they kind of, it's easy for them to pick that cynicism up. And one of the things that I've asked them to do repeatedly is to look around at the world and do a better job of correctly assessing how much of what they enjoy is a result of trust. Somebody that I trust, or somebody that someone trusted built the house I live in. And they did it well. And it's literally stood for 100 years.
yeah.
When I get in my car and drive down the street, I put a high level of trust in the people that are coming towards me. And just
And then the people who
everything
built
that
the car.
even yes, that they would do a good job and that they put care and thought into that. And I guess what I'm just saying is it's really delightful, actually, once you start spinning down that road to figure out, to start to think about how much the world around us demonstrates with ample evidence that people are actually good, that
I
they
love that.
do amazing things together, that they when they live in high trust societies, the benefits exist to everyone. And I guess I just want to link that to this particular point, because what curiosity is the first step to establishing trust. And it's one of the first ways that it's one of the first, I guess, defenses we can have against people who are trying to break down our trust in one another. We can choose to be curious and try to understand why that's happening, and refuse to let ourselves have our trust in each other undermined for no good reason.
Yeah, well, I'm going to count that as a bonus principle, one we weren't even planning on. But the peacemakers lean into trust, right?
Yep.
I love that. Okay, so a fourth principle is that peacemakers choose love instead of hate, especially towards the people they disagree with or who have treated them poorly. And you can see how all of these principles actually interrelate with one another, but they emphasize different things. And I think this has got to be one of the most difficult principles of peacemaking. It's why, of course, everybody knows that Jesus says, love your enemies, but that's oftentimes, it's part of his sayings that people call the hard sayings of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the easy part. And there's lots of examples of this. I think about Enos from the Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon, yeah.
He goes into the woods to pray for repentance, for forgiveness of his sins, and he receives that. He hears the voice of God granting him forgiveness. It's this amazing experience. But then that expands his heart. I think about like the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, right? I still have little kids, so we watch that every Christmas, right? And when he hears the Who's singing, right, his heart expands, of one size and then two sizes and three sizes. So I think Enos's heart expands a size, and it expands to now include his people, the Nephites, and he prays for them, and he prays for their welfare. That's absolutely appropriate. We care about ours, right? Our family, the people around us.
That's actually harder than we give it credit for. So, right, he starts with himself and then he moves to the people closest to him.
Yeah. And then his heart grows some more, when he hears God's voice and reassurance. And then he takes that kind of risky move to pray for the people. And again, he's now multiple generations into the conflict between the Nephites and the Lamanites. We don't know that much about him, but he may well have been part of it. We know because he reports that at this point already, the Nephites had talked about the Lamanites as being wild and ferocious and a bloodthirsty people full of idolatry and filthiness. So they already had stories about these people who were their cousins. These are like their second and third cousins. Yeah,
we've already started using that dehumanizing language we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah. But his heart has grown, and so he prays for them. And what I love is that in this moment when he prays for them, he doesn't say, God, please bless the wild and ferocious and bloodthirsty people, right? He calls them his brethren, right? He sees people as people, not as objects, right? and he recognizes their common humanity. Now, they're literally part of a family tree that they can trace back to Lehi and Sariah, but aren't we all, right, in a way? And he prays for them. And it's that prayer, actually. We know that there's, at the end of the book, right, spoiler alert, all the Nephites are killed and the Lamanites are preserved. But actually, this comes back to prayers that the Nephites had prayed for the Lamanites on their behalf. It's these kinds of prayers. And so I think, and as I thought about this, Jen, this is where it is embarrassing for me. Like, I don't know that I pray that way very often, right? I don't know that, like, really my heart turns to prayer, not to change other people, right? But that God would genuinely bless other people. Like, do I pray with that heart of love towards the people that I too often think of as my enemies?
We're talking today about principles of leadership.
Yeah.
And I just really want to put a pin in this, because it is absolutely fundamentally critical that we select leaders who choose love instead of hate. Especially against people that they don't like or that they don't think will support them. And if our leaders are, it's so easy for us. I just think you've pointed out, Patrick, it's human nature to set ourselves up at enmity with one another, right? It's really easy for me to get offended by someone, to be hurt by something that they did to me, and decide that I'm going to carry that forward for months and years. That's just easy. And if the leaders around me are encouraging me to do that, are prompting me to do that, are telling me that it's in my best interest to do that, it's really easy to see how our society rapidly starts to break down. What we need from our leadership are people who say, hey, I am firm about this principle of right or wrong, or I'm firm about this principle about what I hope to accomplish for our nation or our state or our city, but I am never going to use hate towards other people as a mechanism to get something accomplished. I think that's a really early red flag for us or a later red flag actually, that we should be able to see and use as we judge and select the people who are going to lead us. One of the final things we want to talk about is the fact that peacemakers are proactive and courageous. And for me, and I think for many people, one of the best examples of peacemaking in the Book of Mormon comes from a group of Lamanites who, once they had accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ, once they had quite literally transformed their hearts into just pure disciple hearts, they chose to bury their swords in the ground as a sign that they were not going to fall back into hatred and violence. And these converts, called the anti-Nephi Lehis, were considered traitors by the other Lamanites, who saw them as I think, abandoning them, and potentially saw them as people that were a threat to their security and safety, because they felt that the Nephites were a threat to their security and safety. And those Lamanites then came after them and attacked them. The response to that attack is, to me, one of the greatest examples of proactive and courageous peacemaking that we have ever encountered. As the attacking Lamanite army approached, they didn't retrieve their weapons and fight back. They didn't yell, and they didn't run away. Instead, they went out to meet them and prostrated themselves before them. They basically put their bodies between the invaders and the safety of their families. As the Lamanites continued to attack them, they were instantly confused, because that is not how people should behave, and it caused them to drop their weapons. It brought them to a sense of the harm that they were doing in a way that yelling, fighting, arguing never could have. And so it's just really important to point out that in the midst of a bloody years-long war, what stopped an invading army in their attacks was the courageous act of an unarmed group of people who proactively chose peace rather than choosing an unending war. And I just want to be really briefly and honest and say that this is hard. We're asking for a hard thing. And it's a lot harder if earlier on in our cycle we've made bad choices regarding how we tolerate division, enmity, and dehumanization. It's going to be harder for us to make peace with people that we see as our enemies. But that courage is going to be necessary if we want to bring peace. And so, I don't know, Patrick, tell me what your thoughts about that. How do we benchmark leaders on whether they have the courage to lead us towards peace, or because courage towards leading a group of people towards war is actually pretty easy. It's
That's
hard to have the
exactly.
courage to lead them towards peace.
Well, and that's the thing. Do you? It's easier to throw red meat. It's easier to just attack. It is far more courageous to do what the anti-Nephi Lehi's did. It's far more courageous. We talked earlier about Pahoran, right? That's a courageous response to Moroni. And when you think about people like Gandhi and his followers, when you think about Martin Luther King and their followers, it is an act of supreme courage to go and to stand for love and to stand for peace when you know that you're going to be attacked. You know that you're going to be called weak. You know that you're going to be called passive. You know that you're going to be...
You might physically be harmed.
You might be harmed, right? Emotionally, physically, reputationally, you might be harmed. You may be seen as not standing up for things that really matter, right? When in fact you are standing up for the things that matter most. And so it's easy to say in the abstract, right? This is one of the things, frankly, that continues to inspire me as a peacemaker, is the examples of those who have courageously chosen the path of sacrifice, because that's what it is.
And that leads us, I think, perfectly into our last kind of leadership quality, which is that peacemakers understand the transformational value of sacrifice.
Yeah. And this can be hard, and maybe we'll spend a whole episode on this at some point in the future. But I do hear sometimes, when I talk about this, the necessity of sacrifice as part of peacemaking. There's a danger here to say, oh, so now you're asking the victims to suffer more, and that is tricky ethically and morally. But what I do want to point out is that the greatest icons of peacemaking are people who were themselves marginalized and oftentimes victims, right? So Gandhi did not operate from a place of privilege. King did not operate from a place of privilege. And think of somebody, like Malala, right, does not operate from a place of privilege. And so these are people who are operating from a place where they have been on the receiving end of violence and conflict and injustice. And of course, the greatest example here, and this is who the Book of Mormon witnesses of as the perfect example of peacemaking, is Jesus. Right? Abinadi, when he talks about publishing peace and so forth, he's pointing us to the Prince of Peace, to Jesus. Jesus was not operating from a place of privilege. He was operating from the bottom of society, not the top of society. And he willingly sacrificed for the cause of peace. I mean, he tells Peter, I could bring legions of angels, right? He could have chosen a different path. He could have chosen the path of the zealots. He could have tried to bring about righteousness in a different way. We've talked about the temptations that he had in the wilderness. We've talked about all these different, but he rejected that for a path of self-sacrifice, and that's what he calls us to in the work of peacemaking as well. It's a difficult conversation. There's a lot of ethical, conversations that can be fraught around that, but it's hard to avoid, actually. How do you think about this, Jen?
Well, I'm going to argue, even though I don't think I have very much, but that's probably wrong, that it also requires a lot of... Christ asks us, if we're going to be peacemakers, that means that we also have to sacrifice from a point of privilege. So some of our best peacemakers have also been people who were in a position of significant power and authority, and yet said, hey, I'm going to give that up in order to move towards something better. And there are beautiful examples of that in the Book of Mormon. Alma, ultimately the sons of Mosiah and, Alma the Younger. Lots of examples of leaders who said, I can have a certain kind of power and authority, but moving towards peace, moving towards Christ is actually asking me to give up worldly power and authority, sacrifice that, and start to move towards peace. There are really great leaders in our own country who also
and actually,
follow that
King
pattern.
and Gandhi are good examples of this. They could have lived,
Yes.
even though they were part of marginalized communities, Gandhi could have lived a comfortable life as a lawyer.
Yes.
King could have lived a comfortable life as a pastor. Right?
George Washington
even
could have lived a very comfortable life, right? Under the authority of the king. He would have been an elite, right? So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that whether we're coming at it from a position of oppression or whether we are coming at it from a position of comfort, being a peacemaker, what Christ has outlined for us, a pathway, is going to require sacrifice from us. And insofar as that relates to leaders, I think we always have to be very, very cautious when we are selecting leaders who tell us nothing will be required from us. We are going to get a magical society either by not giving up anything, giving up our sins to have that magical society, right? Or that there are going to be other people that leader can get to pay so that we don't have to in any way be harmed or hurt. Whether it's we're going to get other people to pay for things literally physically, or whether we're going to get other people to, bear the burdens of just anything in our society. So that, as I think one of the things that we really wanted to conclude with was just, we don't hear sacrifice talked about a lot. In fact, we hear it denigrated a lot in our society. But for anyone who truly is a disciple of Jesus Christ, we are forced early on to wrestle with the fact that to follow him is to be willing to sacrifice. And that is one of the ways that when our lives are over, he will know us as his. And so we just would encourage you, as you start to think about how you're going to be selecting the society that we live in, making choices about that, to look towards leaders who both are willing to truly humbly sacrifice, but also that they understand the value of asking us to sacrifice not just things but our sins that call us out when we're like not being awesome.
Yeah, fantastic. Can I conclude with so we've talked about all these principles that we hope that people bring, as they look at the ballot and as they go up and down and choose the people that they will lead our society for the next X number of years. But I just want to make a final plea, if it's okay, just for the act of voting. Is that okay?
Please.
And I want to do this with a personal story, and I'll try to tell it quickly. So I lived in Egypt for a couple of years, and I was there from 2007 to 2009. It was during the 2008 election when Barack Obama was running against John McCain. And I was teaching American history. Most of my students were Egyptians and other Arabs, and I thought it would be kind of fun at this university in Egypt to have a mock election, right? Because I was teaching American history, American studies, so okay, we're in the midst of this. So I set up kind of in the main kind of opening, or kind of like a quad in the middle of campus. I set up this big booth with a McCain booth and Obama booth, and we had their platforms listed out, so people could come and see. And we had it up all day so people could come and we bribed them with candy if they voted or something like that. But anybody, faculty, staff, students, anybody could come and vote at these places. And so it was just kind of a fun thing to try to teach about American elections and so forth. Now, it won't shock you that in 2008 the Iraq War was ongoing, et cetera. It will not shock you. Who do you think won this election of people in the Middle East? Barack Obama did. It was a landslide. It was like 90% or something like that. Okay, but that wasn't the point. The point of the story is, so after this was done, I went back to the department office, and we had this lovely Egyptian woman named Shireen who had helped me set everything up, set up the booths and everything. And I went back at the end of the day and I said, "Hey, Shireen, how did you think it went?" And she got kind of quiet, and she said, I think it went really well. It was a lot of fun. We had a great turnout and everything. But she said, it meant a lot to me, and she started crying. And she said, "I know that this didn't matter. I know it was just for fun. I know it was just a mock election." But she said, "This was the first time in my life that I actually had a choice when I voted. And so every time I vote, Jen, I can't help but think about Shireen and all of the Shireens all over the world, right? That either live in places where they don't get a vote or where their votes really don't matter, right? It's a sham of an election when they do vote. And so I just want to encourage everybody out there in the sound of my voice, right? I mean, vote for yourself, vote for the people around you, but also vote for the Shireens all around the world who do not have the privilege and the blessing of being able to actually choose their local, their national leaders.
And I am going to add one final push to that as well, which is there is no more peaceful way to transform your society than through the vote. Every other mechanism for bringing someone to power is going to involve more coercion, more violence, not less. And so if you truly are committed to a peaceful society, then be committed to democracy, because it's a wonderful opportunity for people to exercise their own agency and to do so in a way where we have a peaceful transfer of power, which is so important. It's a way for us to change our government without violence, and always with the hope that if we didn't win, then next time we'll come around and work harder to argue our point. So I agree, Patrick. Like, we just hope everyone in the sound of our voice applies the principles of peacemaking that we've shared today as they select their leaders, and then most importantly, does the hard and moral work of casting a vote.